Yeah, in this next one, our focus is on multi-factor, where the next two chapters are more focused on multi-factor based. This means, especially if the interest rates across different maturities change in a different manner, how do I probably hedge my portfolio? Because there is a good chance that duration based hedging may or may not be effective in that case, because in the duration, even in the current calculation, or what wherever we have done the duration calculation just now, what we have looked at is, if the interest rate changes by some percentage, what is the impact on the price of the bond. So for the whole bond, we have taken one single change in the interest rate. Whereas in reality, it may so happen that for a different periods, the interest rates could change differently or could react differently. So the interest rates may not be having a parallel shift. And that is where the multi-factor model is coming into picture, because most of the single factor duration or convexity based model which we have worked on for hedging the portfolio, it is very effective when the interest rates shift in a parallel fashion. But when they shift in a non-parallel fashion, especially when the short-term rates are more or long-term rates are changing lesser, any of those non-parallel shifts kind of mechanism, the hedging is not that effective using a plain duration or convexity kind of stuff. And that is where we are talking about the interest rates, multiple changes in the interest rate for multiple maturity periods. That is where we are using a mechanisms like key rate based approach and bucket based approach. We'll see those two approaches. When we are talking about the key rate exposure, all we are talking of is along the term structure, we will find out the risks, not as a combo for all the maturity. Duration was doing actually a combo for the entire maturity. Whereas in this approach, along the term structure, we'll identify the risk. Okay, from probably for a 2-year maturity, what is the risk? What is the duration? For a 5-year maturity, what is the duration? For a 10-year maturity, what is the duration? And after that, we'll combine all of them to find out the overall duration or overall convexity of the portfolio. That is where we are bringing in the scenario of key rate, which means the initial duration was primarily based on YTM. The actual effective duration or whatever we have computed was primarily based on YTM. Here it is based on spot rates. Here we are trying to find out the durations based on the spot rate, not based on the YTM. That's the major difference, right? If I am finding out the which means if the 2-year interest rate is changing, what would be, and assume that the 5-year, 10-year, 8-year, no interest rates are changing, only the 2-year interest rate is changing. What could be the impact on the price of the bond? So I am not looking at the entire YTM changing by 5.5% here. I'm only looking at only a 2-year spot rate changing by 0.5% and no other spot rate changing at all. Whatever is the change in the price of the bond that is coming up, which means actually speaking, I will not discount. To put it in simple terms, I will, if at all these are my cash flows, probably only this one I will change, right? Only probably, let's say initially these are 7.58. Let's say these are the percentages associated here. Now what I'm saying is, keeping all these interest rates constant, only the 2-year interest rate changing from 8%. Okay, let me take this number here, 94.83. Now only if this rate is changed and no other rates are changed, the change in the price of the bond, 94.77. From 94 point something earlier, now it has become 94.77. That is what I am calling as a duration associated only with the 2-year. So that is what I am calling as a key rate duration for that. And if I am finding out the DV01 associated with that, I call it as a key rate 01. The same equivalent of DV01, when I take it to the spot rate terminology, I am calling it as key rate 01. The duration, if I am carrying it on to this spot rate terminology, I am calling it as a key rate duration. And similarly, so for that, even for the computation of the spot rates, we were talking about the using treasury securities only, that too on the run treasury securities, which are more like very recently issued and very actively traded kind of securities. From those securities prices, we will derive the spot rates. Even for deriving of our spot rates, we have used the similar mechanism. And those spot rates, if I am varying by 1 basis point and finding out what is the change in the price, I am calling it as key rate 01. If I am finding out the duration associated with just changing only the 2-year spot rate and not the other rates, I am calling it as the key rate duration. Only that one key rate, which is a 2-year maturity rate, only is changing. What is the duration that is corresponding only to that change? That is what we are calling as the key rate 01. And there is a parallel, another name called partial 01s in this context. Instead of spot rates, if I use the swap rates, I am calling it as partial 01. The same as your key rate 01 and key rate duration. If I am finding out the change in the price based on the swap rates and not the treasury bond rates. See, the treasury bond, based on the treasury securities, if I am deriving the rates, I am calling as spot rates. Based on the swap transactions, if I am deriving the rates, I am calling them as the swap rates. And that swap transactions, based on the riskiness that could be associated between the parties, the swap rates could differ. So when I am taking my each year interest rate based on the swap rates, we are calling as partial 01. When I am doing the same thing with respect to the treasury rates, we are calling as key rate 01 kind of exposure. So these are the three various securities which are typically used. When YTM is used, we are calling as one factor model, which is a duration, and DV01. When I am using the spot rates or the treasury bonds, treasury securities from where the spot rates are derived, we are calling it as key rate duration and key rate 01. When we are using swap rates or the swap transactions for different maturities and then arriving at kind of a zero coupon bond rates, we are calling them as swap rates, and that swap rate where the association is partial 01 kind of stuff. And another mechanism is forward bucket 01. Forward bucket is nothing but based on the yield curve, okay, between 0 to 1 year maturity. This is the interest rate. So the forward rate between 1 and 2 years is 9%. Between 2 and 3 years is 9.5%. Based on the spot rate curve, we can get a forward rate curve, and that forward rate curve, when I am using, I am calling that that kind of a exposure as forward bucket 01 for the entire maturities between 1 and 2 years. If I am using that forward rate for all the maturities between 1 and 2 years, if I am using the forward rate as the discounting factor, I am calling it as a forward bucket 01 kind of mechanism. It's nothing but All these are actually breaking down my whole bond portfolio into various maturities, so that I'll find the duration of each of the maturities separately and do the hedging for each of the parts separately. So in any kind of a key rate thing, so we are talking of, let's say if I'm going with the spot rates, all of them are similar. Let's say if I'm going with a spot rate, right? To derive the spot rates, we are saying on the run treasury securities are required. The most common treasury securities that are generally used are 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, 30-year, because bonds wise, these are the most common tradable bonds on the US market. A 2-year maturity bond, 5-year, I mean, they are all coupon based bond. They are not zero coupon bond. Based on these, I can find out the spot rates. 2-year spot rate can be found out, 5-year spot rate, 10-year spot rate, and 30-year spot rate can very well be found out. And they are generally the par yield bonds. They mature at the par value itself. So these are the different kinds of bond. Probably if there are some other maturities, we can very well consider them, but the most common kind of maturities are these. Now what we are saying is, if at all the interest rate of these change, only one of them change by 1 basis point, right? If the 2-year interest rate changes by 1 basis point and not the 5, 10 and 20 years, what would be the impact on the bond? So it's as good as saying you change only this spot rate. Don't disturb these 3 spot rates. You are finding out the value of the bond. Similarly like this, and there is one more assumption that is being coming up, because we are taking only these 4 spot rates. What this mechanism is also assuming is, if the 2-year, look at this, if the 7-year spot rate, let's say this is the 7-year spot rate, if this is changing, if this 7-year spot rate is changing, what it is saying is, let's say we are considering, probably let me take this example itself. See, we have considered 2, 5, 10 and 30 years, right? We did not consider 3, 4, we did not consider all the spaces. So what this is saying is, okay, if at all I have to see, what if this changes, right? What if this changes? What it is saying is, all the bonds which are having maturities between 0 to 5 years will be impacted by this rate. All the bonds which are lying between the before period and the after period, whose maturities are within that particular period, you impact all of them with this 2-year change. Let's say if the 2-year interest rate, the other way to talk about is, let's say if the 2-year interest rate is increased by 0.5%. What it is saying is, it cannot be a sudden increase of 0.5%. What you are saying is, you assume that the change in the interest rate is gradual. So for that, what it is saying is, between 0 and 5, this is the rate of change. So probably there is so if this is 0.5% change, probably for 1.5 year, take it as 0.4% change, and here also take it as 0.4% change, and probably like this up to 0 and here up to 5. You consider a gradual, see, let's say if there are coupons, right? A coupon is paid at 0.5 years, coupon is paid at 1 year, coupon is paid at 1.5 year, right? Let's look at this kind of a scenario. A better way I'll put it. Let's say I have a 20-year bond, and in that the same example which we have considered earlier, 2.5 is what is paid, let's say for 40 periods. 2.5 is what is paid for 40 periods, and let's say 102.5 is what is paid on maturity, right? And for example, I am saying the interest rates, let's say as per YTM, I am considering 2.5 across. As a YTM, I am considering 2.5% across. Sorry, 2.25, the earlier example. If I was using YTM, I was considering 2.25% across. And this is what I have used for finding out the price of the bond. So it's as good as probably earlier case we have used. Let's say this is 1, 2. So probably the price of the bond is nothing but this divided by 1 plus this to the power this. Okay, so the total price of the bond is coming out as the sum of all these things. So the price of the bond has come out to, let's say something like this, 106. Now what I am saying is the interest rates we know for a 2-year period, for a 5-year period. Now in this model, let's say I know the 2-year rate. 2-year rate is something here. If in this example, I'll take that the 2-year rate is 2%. I'll make an assumption based on the run securities. I'll take a 2-year spot rate. 2-year spot rate, I'll take it, let's say, as 2%. A 5-year spot rate, I'll take it as 2.5%. Right? A 10-year spot rate, I'll take it as 3%. And probably a 20-year spot rate, I'll take it as 3.5%. Let's say something like this. Right? Now, what it is saying is, now that you are using only these 4 rates, but your coupons are there across all the rates. So, what it is saying is, okay, if you are talking of this 2% here, okay, here you take it as 2%, which is 2 years. But this will have an influence right from this to here as well as this to here. The influence of this interest rate is across this particular interval. The influence of this interest rate is across this particular interval. That is what, if you see here, if I know that this is the 7-year interest rate, this is the 7-year interest rate, what it is saying is it will have an influence right from